Hannah stepped off the transport shuttle onto the gleaming metal platform of Nexus Academy. The massive space station rotated slowly against the backdrop of three purple suns, its crystal spires reaching toward the infinite darkness of space. Round her, alien students of dozens of species moved with confident grace. Tall, elegant beings with silver skin and flowing robes, insectoid creatures with clicking mandibles, and the unmistakable blue-skinned Eltarians who ran this prestigious institution. Hannah clutched her datapad tighter, feeling the weight of being one of only 12 humans ever accepted to the Academy. The other species had been traveling between stars for millennia while humanity had barely left their solar system. 50 years ago, she could feel curious eyes studying her as she walked through the corridors lined with floating holographic displays showing complex mathematical formulas that seemed to dance in the air. The Advanced Galactic Mathematics classroom was a marvel of alien technology. Instead of simple desks, students sat in floating pods that adjusted to each species' unique physiology. The walls themselves were alive with shifting equations, three-dimensional graphs that rotated and pulsed with different colors representing various dimensional theories. Hannah found her assigned pod in the back corner. Noting how the other students gave her a wide berth, she heard whispered conversations in languages she couldn't understand. But the tone was universal: doubt, curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed amusement. Professor Vextar entered the room like a storm, standing nearly 8 feet tall. His blue skin shimmered with bioluminescent patterns that indicated his mood and intellectual status among Eltarians. His forearms moved independently as he manipulated holographic displays with practice ease, calling up equations that made the air itself seem to vibrate with mathematical energy. Each of his four eyes could focus independently, and right now, all four were locked onto Hannah with unmistakable disdain. Students. His voice resonated with the authority of someone who had been teaching advanced mathematics since before Earth had developed it. In language, today we begin our exploration of transdimensional calculus. This subject has challenged the greatest minds in the galaxy for over 2,000 years. He gestured to a floating equation that appeared above the center of the room, its symbols shifting and morphing as variables changed in real time. Several alien students leaned forward in their pods, their various appendages, tentacles, claws, manipulator arms, moving as they tried to follow the complex transformations. Miss Lee, Professor Vextar's voice cut through the classroom like a plasma blade. All conversation stopped. Every alien eye, compound eye, optical sensor, and photoreceptor in the room focused on the small human girl in the back corner. Perhaps you should transfer to basic arithmetic. This class discusses theoretical physics beyond your species' comprehension. The silence that followed was deafening. Hannah could hear the subtle hum of the station's artificial gravity generators, the whisper of recycled air through the ventilation systems, and what she was certain was the sound of her own heartbeat. A few alien students made sounds that she was learning to recognize as their species' equivalent of snickering. Hannah remained silent, her dark eyes moving methodically across every holographic display in the room, while Professor Vextar waited for her response, expecting either tears, anger, or submission. She was doing something that would have astounded him if he had known her mind. Enhanced by a genetic quirk that occurred in perhaps 1 in 10 million humans, was recording everything with perfect clarity. Every equation, every symbol, every mathematical relationship displayed in the room was being stored in her memory with photographic precision. The professor's bioluminescent pattern shifted to show increased irritation at her lack of response. Did you not hear me? Primitive. Your kind barely understands basic physics. You have no place in this classroom. What Professor Vextar didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Hannah had spent her first week at the academy doing something impossible by their standards, while other students struggled with their assigned readings. She had accessed the Academy's vast digital library and absorbed its contents with the speed of a quantum computer. Texts on advanced mathematics, theoretical physics, dimensional engineering, and xenobiology, subjects that took Altarian students decades to master, had been memorized and understood in days. She knew about the professor's own published papers, including the 3 fundamental errors in his most famous theorem that had gone unnoticed for 40 years. She understood the flaws in the Academy's teaching methodology and had already formulated improvements to 17 different mathematical principles that the greatest minds in the galaxy considered unchangeable law. But she also understood something else that her extraordinary intelligence had taught her. Timing was everything. So she simply nodded politely at the professor's insult and said quietly, "I understand, Professor. I'll work harder to keep up." The other students relaxed some, making what sounded like approving noises at what they saw as the human knowing her place. Professor Vextar's bioluminescent pattern shifted to satisfaction as he turned back to his lesson, believing he had properly established the natural order of intellectual hierarchy in his classroom. Had none of them realized was that they had just made the biggest mistake in galactic academic history. 3 days had passed since Professor Vextar's first insult, and Hannah could feel the tension building in the classroom like static electricity before a storm. The other students had grown bolder in their dismissive attitudes, with some of the more arrogant Altarian pupils making clicking sounds with their throat pouches whenever she entered the room. Their species equivalent of laughter. The advanced galactic mathematics classroom buzzed with nervous energy as Professor Vextar prepared for what he had announced would be a special demonstration. His forearms moved in complex patterns, manipulating holographic controls that materialized equations. In the air-like glowing sculptures, the mathematical formulas twisted and turned, their symbols pulsing with different colors as variables shifted in real time. Park Jin sat 2 pods away from Hannah, his face pale with worry. He had been her only friend since arriving at the Academy, another human who understood the constant pressure of being surrounded by species that viewed them as barely evolved primates. His whispered warnings over the past few days had been getting more urgent. Other students were talking, and Professor Vextar was planning something big. Today, the professor announced, his bioluminescent skin pattern shifting to show his excitement. "We will witness the fundamental limitations of certain species when confronted with true mathematica. Complexity." His full eyes swept the room, pausing meaningfully on each human student before settling on Hannah. "I present to you the Voldoran paradox." The equation that materialized above the classroom was unlike anything the students had seen before. It wasn't just complex, it was beautiful in its impossibility. Geometric shapes rotated within mathematical frameworks that seemed to bend space itself. The formula stretched across multiple dimensions, with variables that referenced quantum states, gravitational fields, and temporal mechanics simultaneously. Several alien students gasped in recognition. The Voldoran paradox was legendary in academic circles, a mathematical puzzle that had stumped the greatest minds in the galaxy for over 60 years, even the ancient crystalline entities, beings of pure mathematical thought, had declared it unsolvable using conventional methods. This equation, Professor Vextar continued, his voice growing more pompous with each word, represents the theoretical framework for instantaneous matter transmission across galactic distances. Solving it would revolutionize space travel, making our current starships obsolete overnight. The greatest Altarian mathematicians have worked on this for decades without success. A low murmur rippled through the classroom. Students leaned forward in their floating pods, their various appendages twitching with excitement and nervousness. This wasn't just a lesson. This was a public execution disguised as education. "Miss Lee," Professor Vextar's voice boomed across the room like a weapon being fired. Since you seem so confident in your abilities, please solve this equation for us. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the station's ambient hum seemed to quiet, as if the academy itself was holding its breath. Hannah felt every eye in. The room focused on her, felt the weight of expectation and the certainty of her expected failure pressing down like the gravity of a collapsing star. Park Jin's whispered voice broke through the tension. "Hannah, you don't have to." But Hannah was already moving. She stood from her pod with fluid grace, her dark eyes fixed on the impossible equation floating in the center of the room, as she walked toward the holographic display. Her mind was already racing through calculations. At superhuman speed, the photographic memory that had allowed her to absorb the Academy's entire mathematical database was now working in overdrive, connecting patterns and relationships that existed across dozens of different theoretical frameworks. The holographic interface responded to her touch, and she began to work. Her hands moved with startling speed, manipulating variables and transforming sections of the equation with movements that seemed almost like a dance. Mathematical symbols flowed round her fingers like living things, responding to her will as she guided them through transformations that defied conventional logic. What happened next left the entire classroom stunned into silence. The impossible equation began to change, its chaotic complexity slowly resolving into elegant simplicity. Variables that had seemed unrelated suddenly connected in ways that made perfect sense. Dimensional barriers that had blocked solutions for decades dissolved under her touch like morning mist. Within minutes, she had not only solved the core paradox, but had begun showing alternative approaches. Her first solution was clean and direct, cutting through the mathematical maze with surgical precision. Her second approach revealed hidden symmetries in the equation that suggested entirely new branches of mathematics. Her third method was so elegant that it seemed to sing with mathematical beauty, each step flowing naturally to the next like poetry written in numbers. The classroom had gone from tense silence to absolute shock. Advanced Altarian students who had been studying mathematics for decades stared at the holographic display with expressions of disbelief. Some of the more emotional species had begun making sounds of distress, their worldview cracking under the weight of what they were witnessing. Professor Vextar's bioluminescent patterns had shifted to colors that indicated severe psychological distress. His forearms hung limply at his sides as he stared at the solved equation, his mind struggling to process what had just happened, the mathematical framework that had defined his career, the unsolvable puzzle that had frustrated the greatest minds in galactic history, had been conquered by a human girl in less than 10 minutes. The implications were staggering. If the Voldoran paradox could be solved, it meant that humanity's approach to mathematics was fundamentally different from every other species in the galaxy. It suggested that human minds could see patterns and connections that had remained invisible to alien intelligence for millennia. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft hum of the Academy's systems and the sound of all students struggling to process what they had witnessed. In that moment, everything changed. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted, and it had happened in a mathematics classroom. Professor Vextar's massive frame trembled as he stared at the holographic display, his four eyes, each capable of processing visual information faster than most species' entire nervous systems, moved frantically across the solved equation. The bioluminescent patterns on his blue skin flickered through colors that hadn't been seen in Altarian academic circles for centuries, deep purples and violent reds. That indicated complete intellectual shock. Impossible, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the Academy's quantum processes. Humans cannot comprehend such mathematics. Your species was discovering fire when we were mapping the curvature of space-time. The other students remained frozen in their floating pods, their various sensory organs locked onto the impossible scene unfolding before them. A crystalline entity student, whose body was composed of living mathematical equations, actually began to crack along its surface as it tried to process what it was seeing. The soft tinkling sound of its fracturing crystal body echoed through the stunned silence. Hannah turned to face the professor with an expression of calm that seemed almost supernatural given the magnitude. Of what had just occurred, her dark eyes held no trace of triumph or arrogance, only the quiet confidence of someone who had always known this moment would come. "Professor," she said in a voice that carried clearly through the classroom, "your original theorem has a fundamental flaw. You've been approaching dimensional physics from a limited perspective." The accusation hit Professor Vextar like a plasma bolt. His forearms began to gesture wildly, his species equivalent of sputtering indignation. "Limited perspective. I have been studying mathematics for over 300 years. My work on dimensional theory is taught in every major academic institution across 12 galactic sectors." But Hannah had already turned back to the holographic display. Her hands moved with the fluid grace of a master artist, manipulating the mathematical interface as if she had been born to it. New equations began to form in the air around her, more complex and beautiful than anything the Academy had ever seen. "The problem," she continued, her fingers dancing through calculations that made the air itself shimmer with mathematical energy, "is that you've been thinking in terms of barriers and limitations. You see dimensions as walls to be broken through, but they're actually doorways to be opened." What emerged from her calculations was nothing short of revolutionary. The equation she constructed didn't just solve the problem of instantaneous matter transmission. It revealed the fundamental structure of reality itself. Space and time weren't separate entities to be conquered, but part of a unified mathematical framework that could be manipulated with the right understanding. Kim Soo, who had been watching from the back of the classroom, leaned forward in her pod with her mouth hanging open. She had roomed with Hannah for 3 weeks and had always known her friend was brilliant, but this was beyond anything she had imagined possible. The quiet girl who spent her evenings reading mathematical texts for fun was rewriting the laws of physics in real time. "Look at this," Hannah said, highlighting a section of her equation with a gesture that made the symbols glow brighter. "If you treat dimensional boundaries as permeable membranes rather than solid walls, you can create resonance patterns that allow matter to exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously." The implications were staggering. Traditional space travel required massive starships that could take months or years to cross between star systems. Military fleets were built around the assumption that distance provided natural defense. Trade routes were established based on the limitations of hyperspace technology that had remained unchanged for millennia. But Hannah's equation suggested something far more radical. If matter could exist in multiple dimensions at once, if the barriers between space and time were just mathematical constructs that could be overcome with the right approach, then the entire structure of galactic civilization would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. A Zephian student, whose species prided itself on logical thinking, raised one of its 6 tentacles in a gesture of confusion. But the energy requirements would be astronomical, even if the theory is sound. No power source in the galaxy could generate enough energy to— Wrong again. Hannah interrupted gently, adding another layer to her equation. "You're still thinking in terms of brute force. The energy is already there, built into the fabric of space itself. You just need to know how to access it." The new calculations she displayed showed how quantum fluctuations in empty space could be harnessed and amplified, using resonance patterns instead of requiring massive power sources. Her method would draw energy directly from the universe's own background radiation. It was like discovering that you could power a starship by plugging into the cosmic microwave background itself. Professor Vextar's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed into his teaching chair with a sound like a small building falling down. His bioluminescent patterns had shifted to colors that indicated complete mental overload. Everything he had believed about mathematics, about physics, about the fundamental nature of reality itself, was crumbling round him like a house of cards in a hurricane. "This changes everything," whispered Park Jin from his pod, his voice filled with awe and terror in equal measure. "Hannah, do you realize what you've done? You've just made every starship in the galaxy obsolete, every military strategy, every trade agreement, every border between civilizations. None of it matters anymore." But Hannah wasn't finished. Her photographic memory was connecting patterns across thousands of mathematical principles she had absorbed from the Academy's databases. Her mind was working at a speed that defied biological limitations, processing information faster than the Academy's quantum computers. "There's more," she said quietly, and began constructing yet another equation. This one was even more complex, its symbols and relationships creating three-dimensional structures that seemed to exist partially outside normal space. "If we can transmit matter instantaneously, we can also transmit information, real-time communication across infinite distances, the end of isolation between star systems." The classroom had become a cathedral of mathematics, with Hannah as its prophet hand, the floating equations as her scripture. Students who had mocked her days earlier now watched in religious silence as she rewrote the rules of the universe itself. The Academy's quantum communication ray lit up like a supernova as news of Hannah's breakthrough rippled across the galaxy at faster-than-light speeds. Within the first hour, 17 different news networks had picked up the story. By the second hour, emergency sessions were being called in government chambers on hundreds of worlds. By the third hour, the most powerful beings in the galaxy were demanding answers. The Grand Council of Sciences, a body so exclusive that entire civilizations had waited centuries for a single representative to be accepted, called an unprecedented emergency meeting. Their crystalline meeting chamber, suspended in the void between three star systems, suddenly became the center of galactic attention as massive starships from dozens of species converged on the Nutra L-Zone. Professor Vextar paced frantically in his private office, his forearms gesturing wildly as he spoke into multiple communication devices at once. His bioluminescent patterns flickered through every color in the Alterian emotional spectrum, settling primarily on the deep oranges and reds that indicated desperation and fury. "She must have cheated," he insisted to the holographic image of High Scholar Kethmul, one of the most respected mathematicians in Alterian history. "No human could possibly understand dimensional mathematics at that level. They've barely mastered basic space flight." The ancient Alterian's image wavered slightly as the transmission crossed several all-star systems. "Vextar, I have examined the recordings of her work. Every calculation is original. Every mathematical leap is documented in real time. If this is cheating, then she has invented an entirely new form of academic dishonesty that transcends the laws of physics themselves." But Professor Vextar wasn't ready to accept defeat. He contacted former students, rival academics, anyone who might support his theory that the human girl had somehow deceived the Academy's most advanced monitoring systems. His calls reached across the galaxy, from the methane clouds of Titan, 7 to the crystal cities of the ethereal collective. "Listen to me," he pleaded with Dr. Zelthun, a crystalline entity whose mathematical abilities were legendary even among his own species. "Run the calculations yourself. Find the error. There has to be an error." The response came back 3 hours later, transmitted through quantum channels that had been buzzing with activity since news of Hannah's discovery broke. Dr. Zelthun's crystalline form appeared in holographic detail, its surface patterns shifting with what could only be described as mathematical excitement. "Vextar, My old friend. The crystalline entity's voice resonated like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. There is no error, in fact. The human's work is so elegant that it has solved 3 additional paradoxes that we didn't even realize were connected to the original problem. She has opened doors that we didn't know existed. Meanwhile, in the Academy's communication center, Choi Min stood watching the chaos unfold with a mixture of pride and amazement. As the human liaison to Nexus Academy, he had fought for years to secure admission slots for human students. The other species had grudgingly agreed to accept a few humans as a gesture of diplomatic goodwill, never expecting them to contribute anything meaningful to galactic science. Now, his communication console was flooded with requests from every major civilization in the galaxy. The ethereal collective wanted to offer Hannah a position in their most sacred mathematical temples. The warrior Krugan Empire, despite their usual focus on military might, had sent 3 battle cruisers loaded with their greatest scientific minds just to verify her calculations. Even the mysterious Shadow Syndicate had broken their usual silence to request copies of her work. Sir, his assistant, a nervous young Altarian named Velta, approached with a datapad clutched in his manipulator arms. We're receiving over 10,000 communication requests per minute. The Academy's quantum processors are starting to overload. Choi Min smiled as he watched the main display screen, which showed starships from across the galaxy converging on Nexus Academy like metal moths drawn to a flame. Massive Altarian research vessels with their distinctive blue hull plating moved alongside the organic bioships of the Zephyrian Collective. The geometric perfection of crystalline entity craft shared space with the intimidating black hulls of Krugan battle cruisers. "Patch me through to the Grand Council chamber," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. It's time they heard from humanity directly. The holographic connection established itself across multiple star systems, linking him to the most powerful scientific minds in the galaxy. The council chamber was a sight to behold. Beings of pure energy floated alongside ancient mechanical intelligences, while creatures that existed partially outside normal space-time observed from dimensions that human eyes couldn't properly perceive. Honored council members, Choi Min began, his words being translated simultaneously into hundreds of languages and communication methods 3 months ago. You questioned whether humans belonged in advanced academic institutions. You wondered if our species had anything meaningful to contribute to galactic civilization. A low murmur rippled through the assembled beings. Sounds that ranged from harmonic tones to electromagnetic pulses to vibrations that existed beyond the normal spectrum of reality. Today, he continued, a human student has solved a mathematical puzzle that has stumped your greatest minds for 60 years. But more than that, she has revealed that human mathematical intuition operates on principles that your species have never considered. We don't just think differently. We think in ways that complement and enhance the scientific capabilities of every other civilization in the galaxy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Offers of research partnerships flooded in from across the known universe. The Vegan Confederation wanted to establish joint human-alien mathematical institutes. The crystalline entities proposed creating hybrid thinking systems that combined their logical processing with human intuitive leaps. Even the proud Altarians, despite their wounded pride, began discussing exchange programs that would bring their best students to learn from human teachers. But perhaps the most significant response came from the Ancient Ones, a species so old and advanced that they rarely bothered to communicate with younger civilizations. Their message was simple but profound. We have watched the galaxy for millions of years, waiting for a species that could see beyond conventional thinking. Humanity has passed the test in his office, Professor Vextar finally stopped making calls. His communication devices lay silent round him as he stared at the latest reports flooding in from across the galaxy. Every major scientific institution had verified Hannah's work. Every attempt to find flaws had instead revealed new applications and possibilities. The human girl hadn't just solved one problem. She had revolutionized mathematics itself. His pride lay in ruins round him. But for the first time since the catastrophic classroom demonstration, he felt something other than anger and desperation. Looking at the elegant mathematical structures that Hannah had created, structures that solved problems he had struggled with for centuries, he began to feel something that surprised him. Wonder. The galaxy would never be the same, and perhaps, he realized, that wasn't such a terrible thing after all. 6 months after that fateful day in the advanced galactic mathematics classroom, the entire galaxy hummed with new energy. Massive construction projects were underway on dozens of worlds as civilizations rushed to build the quantum communication rays based on Hannah's revolutionary equations. The age of isolation was ending, and the age of instant connection had begun. On the outer rim planet of Kepler 9, a mining colony that had waited 3 months for news from their home world suddenly received real-time messages from loved ones across the galaxy. Children laughed as they spoke with grandparents on distant worlds, their voices carried instantly through the quantum networks that Hannah's mathematics had made possible. The loneliness that had defined frontier life for millennia was dissolving like morning mist. At the Nexus Academy, the transformation was even more dramatic. The once pristine corridors that had echoed with Altarian supremacy now buzzed with activity as representatives from hundreds of species arrived daily. Massive cargo ships unloaded equipment for new research facilities, while smaller diplomatic vessels brought delegations eager to establish partnerships with the Academy's new Human Cognitive Research Center. Hannah stood in what had once been a storage bay, watching as construction robots worked alongside alien technicians to build her new laboratory. The space was enormous, with holographic projectors capable of displaying mathematical equations the size of starships. Quantum computers from a dozen different civilizations worked in harmony. Their processing power combined to tackle problems that had seemed impossible just months before. Professor Lee called out Yoon Hyuk, one of the new human students who had arrived as part of the expanded exchange program. His voice carried excitement as he gestured toward a group of alien visitors, the delegation from the Spiral Arm Confederation is here for the demonstration. The demonstration had become a daily occurrence. Species from across the galaxy sent their brightest minds to observe how humans approached mathematical problems, trying to understand the cognitive processes that had led to such revolutionary breakthroughs. Today's group included a magnificent phoenix entity whose body was composed of controlled plasma, a collective intelligence made up of thousands of tiny mechanical units, and several Altarian scholars who watched with expressions of barely contained fascination. But the most significant observer was Professor Vextar himself. The once proud Altarian academic had undergone a transformation as dramatic as the galaxy round him. Gone was the arrogant certainty that had defined his teaching for centuries. In its place was the eager curiosity of a student discovering mathematics for the first time. Today, Hannah announced to the assembled group, her voice carrying easily through the vast space, "We're going to explore how human intuitive thinking can complement logical analysis to solve problems that neither approach could handle alone." She gestured to a holographic display that showed the trade routes between star systems, the old routes, based on hyperspace lanes and gravitational shortcuts, formed a complex web that took weeks or months to traverse, but overlaid on top of them were the new quantum communication networks, connecting every inhabited world in an instant web of light. The traditional approach to this problem would be to optimize each connection individually. She continued, manipulating the display to show how conventional analysis would tackle the challenge. But human thinking allows us to see patterns and relationships that pure logic might miss. As she worked, her hands moving through the holographic interface with fluid grace, something beautiful began to emerge. The quantum network wasn't just a communication system. It was revealing the hidden mathematical structure that connected all matter in the universe. Every planet, every star, every particle of cosmic dust was part of an elegant equation that spanned the entirety of existence. Professor Vextar leaned forward in his floating observation pod, his four eyes wide with wonder. 6 months of studying, and Hannah had taught him more about mathematics than the previous century of traditional education. The rigid thinking that had limited his species for millennia was giving way to something far more powerful: the ability to leap beyond logical constraints and see solutions that existed in the spaces between conventional thoughts. Professor Vextar, Hannah called out, "Would you like to try the next calculation?" The request would have been unthinkable months before, a human teacher asking an Altarian academic to demonstrate his learning. But now it felt natural, part of the new order that was emerging across the galaxy. Vextar approached the holographic display with the careful steps of someone who had learned to question his own assumptions. As he worked through the problem, applying the human-inspired techniques that Hannah had taught him, his bioluminescent pattern shifted to colors that indicated deep satisfaction and joy. The solution that emerged was elegant and powerful, combining Altarian logical precision with human intuitive leaps in ways that neither species could have achieved alone. "I underestimated not just your intelligence," he said to Hannah as the demonstration concluded, "but the power of human intuition combined with analytical thinking. My species spent thousands of years perfecting our logical processes. But we forgot that logic alone can only take you so far." Hannah smiled gently, the same calm expression she had worn during that first confrontation in the mathematics classroom. "Intelligence isn't about the species you're born into, Professor. It's about being brave enough to see beyond conventional thinking." The truth of her words was evident everywhere around them. The Phoenix entity was working with human students to develop new forms of plasma mathematics. The collective intelligence had discovered that human creativity could inspire emergent properties in their networked thinking. Even the Shadow Syndicate had sent ambassadors, curious about cognitive approaches that could penetrate mysteries they had struggled with for eons. As the demonstration ended and the various delegates began to disperse, Hannah walked to the observation deck that looked out over the Academy's sprawling complex. Starships from hundreds of worlds moved through the space around the station like a three-dimensional dance of cooperation and discovery. The galaxy that had once seemed impossibly vast and divided was becoming something new, a community connected not just by quantum networks, but by the recognition that every species brought unique gifts to the great equation of existence. Park Jin joined her at the viewing port, his expression filled with amazement. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if you had just accepted Professor Vextar's insults and transferred to basic arithmetic?" Hannah laughed softly, a sound that somehow managed to capture all the wonder and possibility of the new era they were building. The mathematics was always there, waiting to be discovered. If it hadn't been me, it would have been someone else. The universe has a way of revealing its secrets when the time is right. But as she looked out at the diverse classroom of species that had come to learn from human mathematical approaches, she knew that humanity had finally taken its rightful place among the stars, not as conquerors or subordinates, but as partners in the greatest discovery project of all, understanding the beautiful, complex, ever-changing equation that connected all life in the galaxy. The future stretched out before them like an unsolved mathematical proof, full of infinite possibilities and elegant solutions waiting to be discovered. The end.